So the anthropology of adoption is something that's particularly interesting to me as both an adoptee and an anthropologist. Historically, anthropologists have been very interested in questions about kinship, um, the idea of what makes a family, why do we continue to reproduce, and how do we choose who we include in our family. Adoption is an interesting case because it kind of disrupts this idea of kinship, because adoption across biological lines or adoption outside of biological kinship is something that anthropologists haven't quite been able to explain from an evolutionary perspective. Traditionally, we've understood kinship as a way for humans to reproduce and pass on their genetic traits to their offspring. And so the reason we reproduce is this instinct to preserve our lineage. However, adoption outside of biological ties does not allow for those genes to be passed on. So the question anthropologists ask are, how do we understand these what are called fictive kinship formations? So that's not said to delegitimize the parenting that adoptive parents do or the connection that adoptive parents and adoptees have with each other, but really just these kinship formations that are not based on genetics, that are not based on DNA or blood. How do we understand why people still adopt? Some people have thought it was altruism, so this idea that adoption is this selfless act. And that a lot of that comes from, again, those rhetorics of adoption as salvation, as a type of charity. So, but today it's more commonly thought that adoption is a way to still preserve family lineage, especially for those who are not able to reproduce biologically. They're able to preserve familial lineage through passing on certain cultural practices, language, political beliefs, religion, etc. And so that is a way to still place adoption within this evolutionary framework of why humans behave the way we do and why we adopt across biological ties. The other interesting thing about adoption that a lot of anthropologists are looking at, especially with transnational and transracial adoption, is this question of culture that I've talked a little bit about here. I talked a bit about this search for cultural authenticity. So this idea that in transracial adoption, many adoptees are not around people who are from the same, birth culture that the adoptee is from. Most adoptees are raised in white households and raised in predominantly white communities. And so this idea of cultural authenticity, how does an adoptee experience their own birth culture when they're not around others who can sort of pass that on through their own practices? Many adoptees wonder about whether or not they're able to truly claim, for example, Chinese culture, if it means that they also have to Google what year it is in the Chinese lunar calendar or something like that. And so this question of who owns culture and how is it passed is something that anthropologists have been interested in. The two books that you see on side, The Kinning of Foreigners and How Chinese Are You, are two examples of anthropological works on adoption that have dealt with this question of kinship, and then also this question of preserving an adoptee's birth culture in the absence of having actual ties to that culture through social or familial relationships. The second thing is this idea of being rooted to this geographic homeland. So when we think about, again, immigration and migration, so much of that literature and that discourse discusses this idea of being still connected to the immigrant's homeland, to the immigrant's place of birth or the place that they spent most of their life. But for adoptees, again, because there are not familial ties, because they're removed from other immigrant communities or other communities of color, many adoptees do not actually feel this sense of rootedness to a geographic homeland. So the question that anthropologists ask is, how do adoptees form identity without feeling that sense of rootedness? Because on the flip side, a lot of adoptees, while they spent their entire life in the United States or their other receiving country, do not also feel fully connected to the United States as well. So adoptees kind of exist in this in-between space. And so really what anthropologists are looking at, and what I look at in my own research, is this process of extraterritorial, cultural, racial, and national identity formation. So understanding how adoptees form identity, form a sense of culture, whether that's their birth culture, whether that's their adoptive culture, how they form a sense of racial identity when removed from other communities of color. How do they understand themselves when they feel very removed from the communities of their birth, people that look like them, and then also feel othered by their own adoptive communities? And so The space of kind of in-betweenness that adoptees exist in is where a lot of the current literature on adoption is trying to delve into and just understand what do adoptees go through and how do they make sense of the world around them. So in summary, talked about the way that adoption is often framed as this act of salvation, where the West is usually framed as this culturally, politically, and morally superior to the sending country. Most of the receiving countries for transnational adoption are in the Western Hemisphere, mainly North America and Western Europe. And then also, we talked about the ways that ties to an adoptee's birth country, their family, and their culture are usually cut when they're adopted. Adoptive parents may or may not try and include aspects of their adoptee's birth culture into their practices. However, those more tangible ties of having community or having family somewhere else are usually cut. And so therefore, adoptees are often assimilated into the dominant American culture. For these reasons, adoption is a form of transnationalism. However, it's a very untraditional form of transnational migration, because adoptees are not seen as immigrants because of their lack of ties and because of their privileged immigration. Instead, adoptees are often used as these exceptional examples for American meritocracy and inclusion. So this idea that anybody can find success and find inclusion in the United States if they're willing to assimilate enough. And again, for this reason, adoptees are positioned as these very ideal immigrants due to the fact that they are assimilated at such a young age and so fully enveloped into what is usually the dominant culture in the United States, which is more white, American, and oftentimes Christian as well. And so adoptee experiences, again, are very varied, but one of the main ones that we see in the literature and among other adoptee communities is the sense of racial and cultural isolation. As I said earlier, adoptees have these ties cut and do not feel fully included within white spaces and don't feel fully included in other communities of color, whether that be other Asian communities, Korean, Chinese, or what have you. And so a lot of adoptees express this search for finding this true sense of being their authentic selves and finding belonging. The other main thing that we see coming from adoptees who are speaking out is this desire to promote a more critical understanding of adoption. So that would include talking about the history of adoption, the fact that adoption did not just suddenly appear one day, but it's actually rooted in transnational processes of military interventions and war, of public policy, and that adoption is a very political process, even if it relates to family making. Adoptees also have talked again about advocating for adoptee citizenship. They feel that it's unfair for adoptees to not be able to get automatic citizenship if they had no choice in being brought here anyway. And so a lot of adoptees are advocating for this retroactive citizenship to be applied for those who were not naturalized before 2000. And then finally, and probably most importantly for adoptees, there's this desire to promote more adoptee agency. Again, a lot of the literature, a lot of the media representations of adoption that came out, especially maybe 20 years ago, were really rooted in this idea of promoting adoption as this thing that's only good, can only have positive benefits, and is only beneficial to the adoptee, adoptive family, and the birth family as well. So adoptees, again, in trying to promote a more critical understanding of adoption, are really advocating for adoptee voices to be highlighted, because what adoptees are saying is actually quite different than what adoptive parents and adoption agencies are saying. So in order to have more voices represented, more voices that can shed light on the history of adoption and make people think a little bit more carefully about the way that they understand adoption, has been something that's really important for adoptees. So really, this is all to say that adoption stands as a really interesting example of transnationalism that really challenges a lot of the beliefs and ideas about what it means to be a transnational person, whether that be an immigrant, a refugee, or what have you. And so for anthropologists, this means kind of deconstructing and revisiting the way that we understand our definition of migrant and our definition of what it means to migrate and to find inclusion and belonging in a new country. So thank you very much.